I was 9 years old when I landed on a planet that wanted to kill me for being the wrong shape. That's not how I would have put it at the time. At 9, you don't have the vocabulary for authoritarian geometry, for state-sanctioned persecution, for the precise mechanisms by which a ruling class maintains power through the enforcement of an arbitrary physical standard. At 9, you just know that the creatures dragging you across a courtyard of pink-veined stone are angry at you for reasons you don't fully understand, and that the cage they're putting you in smells like copper and dried grass, and that somewhere across that courtyard, through a slot in a wall, you can hear a dog whimpering. That's where I'll start. Not with the launch, not with the rescue, not with the explosion that knocked my borrowed rocket off course and sent me spinning into the gravity well of a world that shouldn't have existed. I'll start with the cage. That I would learn something about the universe that took me the rest of my life to properly name. The planet was called Pi R squared. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something a child made up, and maybe the child did, because children were the ones most likely to say the actual name aloud without flinching. The adult residents of that world hadn't spoken it openly in years. Papa Drop had rebranded it. He called it the perfected world. His soldiers called it by a designation in their own language that roughly translates to the place of correct forms. But the prisoners, the ones in the cages and the labor pits and the deep basement cells of the Roundy Citadel, they still called it by the old name, in whispers, the way you say a true thing when the guards aren't listening. Before I tell you about Papa Drop, let me tell you how I got there. Because how matters, in a way I didn't appreciate until I was much older and could see the line from beginning to end. I had been watching television in the bush with two kangaroo friends. One lazy and generous, one grumpy and pessimistic, as kangaroos often divide when the news came through. Face, a Russian dog, had been launched into space aboard a satellite, and the mission had gone wrong. The satellite was trapped in orbit. The dog was circling the Earth, with no way down and no way out. And the people responsible for the mission were doing the thing humans do when they've made a mistake too large to easily admit. They were talking around it. Her name was Waika. That's not quite how it was spelled in the broadcasts. But that's how it sounded when I said it. And I said it often in those first hours, because she had a face that required a name. Triangular, broad-eared, with eyes that were too serious for a dog who'd been given no good reason to be serious about anything. She was looking at the camera in the satellite footage. Looking directly at it. The way dogs sometimes look at things that confuse them, turning the problem into a gaze. And something in that look was asking a question that the responsible parties were declining to answer, decided to answer it. The grumpy kangaroo told me it was impossible. The lazy kangaroo told me it was inadvisable. The other bush animals had their own concerns. I listened to all of them with the selective hearing of the determined and went to America, which took some doing, and found my way into a space facility, which took rather more doing, and found a monkey named Buster, who had been training for his own launch and who was amenable to a trade. Buster wanted my watch. It was a small musical watch, the kind that plays a tune when you open the cover, and Buster had a quality about him. A passion for music so total that it organized his entire response to the world, that made the trade obvious to both of us the moment I showed it to him. Gave me his spacesuit. I gave him the watch. I briefly impersonated him to avoid detection, which is harder than it sounds when you're a red-headed Australian girl, and the creature you're impersonating is a space-trained primate. But I managed well enough in dim corridors. The next morning I launched. I want to be careful not to romanticize the launch. I had no training. I had a spacesuit that fit poorly, and a set of controls I'd studied from documentation I'd found in Buster's preparation room. The facility's automated systems did most of the work. I think the technicians monitoring the launch from a different room assumed, for long enough to matter, that I was the scheduled monkey. By the time anyone understood what had happened, I was already in orbit. Finding Waika was not difficult. She found me, in a sense. The satellite's transponder was still functional and I could track it. What was difficult was the approach, because the satellite was spinning slightly, and its docking port was no longer where the schematics said it should be, and I had to make 3 passes before I got close enough to reach the hatch. I've made more competent approaches since. At the time, I was running on the particular fuel of someone who hasn't yet encountered enough failure to believe that failure is a real possibility. I got to her. That's the thing. She was in a small pressurized chamber about the size of a large cupboard, strapped into a restraint designed for a much larger animal. And when the hatch opened, she did not bark, or growl, or lunge, which she could have done, which most animals would have done in her situation. She looked at me with those two serious eyes, and her tail moved once, uncertainly, and then twice, with more conviction, as she worked through whatever calculation dogs use to decide whether the stranger at the door is safe. The satellite exploded 15 seconds after I got her out. I was already in the rocket by then, already sealing the hatch. But the shockwave caught us. A wall of pressure that hit the rocket's hull like a flat hand and knocked us sideways. And then the lateral thrust carried us on to a trajectory I hadn't planned and couldn't immediately correct. The nearest planet with a breathable atmosphere was not Earth. It was something smaller, pinker, with clouds that were too yellow, and a gravity that was 3/4 standard, and a radio silence that was complete and perfect and wrong. Brought us in as carefully as I could. We hit nose first, which is not the ideal angle. The soil was soft enough that the rocket buried itself to a depth of about 6 meters before stopping, which created the second problem. We were stuck, and the rocket's nose was underground and the hatch was above us. And when I got it open and climbed out into the pink-veined courtyard of what turned out to be a roundy processing facility, I was already a prisoner before I'd had time to understand where I was. They were waiting for us. They hadn't been waiting for us specifically. They'd been waiting for anything that fell from the sky. Because Papa Drop's border protocol required the immediate apprehension of all unregistered arrivals. The soldiers who came across the courtyard were efficient and unpleasant and looked, from a distance, almost spherical. Bodies that were nearly all torso, small stubbed limbs, wide flat faces. They wore armor that had been designed, I noticed, to emphasize their roundness. Every piece of it was curved, convex, the aesthetic of a regime that had made its central obsession into its visual grammar. Let me tell you what Papa Drop looked like. He was a roundy, which meant he was roughly spherical, a body that was almost entirely torso, small stubbed limbs, a face that occupied maybe a quarter of his front-facing surface, eyes set wide and flat, mouth a thin, horizontal crease. He was enormous by roundy standards. The roundies measured status by circumference, and Papa Drop had the greatest circumference of any living roundy. He wore a crimson sash that wrapped around his equator, and when he moved, which was rarely, he had servants for movement. He bobbed slightly, like something buoyant in a slow current. His voice was a low, resonant thing, designed by accident of biology to carry across large stone rooms without effort. He was not, by any external standard I can apply now, a frightening creature. He looked, if I'm being honest, almost comic. Inflated, a child's drawing of a tyrant, but the orders he gave were not comic, and the soldiers who carried them out were not comic, and the people in the cages, the ones who were square, or oblong, or irregular, or who had simply been in the wrong place when the sergeant needed his quota, they were not comic at all. I didn't know any of that when they locked the cage. I knew I had Waika pressed against my left side, and she was trembling, and I had my hand on the back of her neck, and I was telling her quietly that it was going to be fine, which was the first of several things I said on that planet that I had no earthly or any otherworldly basis for believing. The cage was a stone-walled enclosure, about 3 meters by 4, with a grated front and a slot in the base of the grate for food. Floor was cold and slightly damp. There were marks on the walls from previous occupants, not writing exactly. More the general record of presence, the marks people make when they want to leave some trace that they existed in a place. Shh. I ran my fingers along some of those marks in the first hours and thought about the people who'd made them. Other prisoners were in adjacent cells, squaries mostly, the roundy's particular term of contempt for any being whose body deviated from the approved spherical standard. Squaries on pi r squared were not technically a separate species. They were roundies who had been born wrong, or who had suffered accidents, or who had simply expressed, somewhere in their genetic material, a tendency toward angles. In Papa Drop's taxonomy, they were a disease. In the sergeant's operations ledger, they were a labor resource. There was a prisoner in the cage next to mine. She was a young squarey. Her body had the slightly compressed lateral shape of someone who'd been born in the mid-range of the deviation spectrum. Not quite square, but clearly not round. She had large, pale eyes, and moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to draw attention. She watched me from the moment they put me in the adjacent cell, and I watched her back. The way you watch anything unfamiliar, when you're trying to understand if it means you harm. After several hours of neither of us speaking, she said something in her language. I didn't understand it. I said so, in mine, and she tilted her head. A gesture I would come to recognize, on that planet, as a near-universal expression of focused curiosity, and tried again, in a different language, and then a third one, and on the fourth attempt, she produced something that was close enough to a dialect I'd heard once from a trader animal back home that I could catch about half of it. What she said roughly was, "You're not a squarey." I said no. She said, "You're not a roundy either." I said no. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "What are you?" I told her I was a human. I told her I was from Earth. I told her my name, which she repeated carefully, turning it in her mouth like a stone she was checking for weight. Her name was Polly. She'd been in the labor camps for 2 years. She'd been brought to this holding cage, she said, as a warning. Papa Drop occasionally rotated prisoners through the Citadel cells to remind the camp population that conditions could always be worse. Worse than the camps, I said. She looked at me with those pale, wide eyes and didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I want to be careful here, because I've told this story many times, and I always risk smoothing it into something neater than it was. Truth is that my first days on Pyre Squared were not heroic. They were frightening and cold, and I cried more than once, quietly, with my face turned away from the other prisoners, because I was 9. And I was alone except for a dog, and the weight of a situation I didn't have the tools to analyze. I was hungry. Food. When they passed through the slot in the cage wall was a dense gray block of something that tasted like chalk crossed with old mushroom, and Waika and I shared it because she needed the calories and I needed to feel useful. Waika, for her part, behaved with a composure that shamed me a little. She sat next to me on the cold floor and leaned her weight into my side, and did not whimper after the first day. She observed the guards with steady, methodical attention, noting their rotation times, their patterns of movement, the particular behaviors that indicated distraction versus alertness. At least that's how it looked. She may simply have been being a dog. I chose to read it as strategy, because it helped me feel less alone in the enterprise. What I had and what I didn't fully understand I had was time. Time to listen to Polly. And Polly, who had been sitting in darkness with nothing to do for 2 years except think, had thought a great deal about the precise nature of Papa Drop's power and where its edges were. She told me about the roundies and the squaries across those first days, in fragments, in the gaps between guard rotations. The old world, the one before Papa Drop, had been a mixed world. Roundies and squaries had not been equal. That would be too simple and too clean. But they had coexisted. They had shared markets and waterways and, in some regions, neighborhoods. The distinction between them had existed, but had not been, in itself, a death sentence. There had been tensions. There had been periods of heightened suspicion, and periods of grudging cooperation, and long stretches of the comfortable, functional mutual tolerance that most cohabiting groups eventually develop. Not because they love each other, but because it's efficient. Papa Drop had changed that. He had been a minor political figure initially, an administrator in one of the Midland provinces, and he had risen through a combination of genuine organizational talent and a rhetoric that was, in retrospect, a masterwork of strategic grievance. He had taken the existing social friction between roundies and squaries, which was real. They had different cultural traditions, different economic niches, different histories of old conflicts that had never quite been resolved, and he had refined it into something pure and lethal. He had made roundness into virtue. He had made angles into corruption, the genius of it. And it was a kind of genius, the terrible mechanical kind, was that he had made it visible. You couldn't fake being a roundy. Your shape was your shape. This meant that every roundy could look at their own body and see virtue, and every squarey could look at their own body and see reflected back at them. The verdict Papa Drop had already pronounced. He hadn't invented the difference. He had simply decided what it meant, and then he had built an entire apparatus to enforce the meaning. The mirrors were central to this. Everywhere in public spaces, mandatory by law, curved to a specific curvature designed in Papa Drop's early years in power, by a mathematician who understood optics, and apparently had no qualms about where the understanding was going. The curvature worked in both directions. It made roundies appear slightly more spherical than they were, and it made squaries appear slightly more angular, small distortions. Imperceptible if you only ever used that mirror. Significant if you understood what you were looking at. Polly told me all of this in the careful, flat voice of someone who has processed a thing until the emotion has been largely drained out of it. Because the emotion is a luxury you cannot afford when you're trying to survive. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, the flatness would slip a little, and I would catch something underneath. Grief. Mostly. And beneath that something older and colder that I think was the specific horror of watching something you loved be deliberately destroyed. There was a time, she said once, when Rolly and I used to walk in the market on festival days. Rolly was Papa Drop's son. I had not yet encountered him and didn't know what to make of that particular detail, so I filed it and moved on. On the fourth day, they moved us to the labor pits. The pits were outside the citadel, a series of broad excavations in the terracotta-colored earth where prisoners dug under the supervision of roundy soldiers armed with long cattle prods that discharged something unpleasant on contact. The work was to excavate the rocket, my rocket, the borrowed American one I'd crash-landed in, from the earth where it had buried itself nose first on impact. The drop, apparently, intended to use it. This was the first time I understood that the situation was larger than my personal inconvenience. Papa Drop wanted the rocket for a reason that Polly explained to me in 2 flat sentences one evening, while we were being marched back from the pit. He intended to launch himself into space and extend his regime to other worlds. Affected world was not an end point. It was a proof of concept. I was 9, but I had been raised by animals who were not cruel, and by a world that, for all its flaws, had not raised me to accept that the shape of your body determined your worth. I looked at the pit, at the hundreds of squarey prisoners, digging my rocket out of the ground so a dictator could use it to do to other planets what he had done to this one. And I felt something that was not exactly anger, because I wasn't old enough to sustain anger cleanly, but was adjacent to it. A deep, stubborn wrongness. The particular human sensation of encountering a thing that should not be, that has no right to exist, and deciding quietly that it isn't going to. I had no plan at that point. I want to be clear about that. I was not operating from strategy. I was from the same place all my best decisions have come from, which is a bone-level certainty about what's wrong, combined with a complete absence of any clear sense of what to do about it. I started by watching. The soldiers were roundies, uniformly so. The army was one of the more stringently curated institutions in Papa Drop's government, and even roundies with mild deviations had been mustered out. They were efficient, the soldiers. They ran their shifts. They managed their prisoner counts. They carried out their orders with the flat competence of men and women who have been told exactly what to do and who lack the imagination to wonder whether they should be doing it. The sergeant was different. He was the biggest roundy I'd seen after Papa Drop himself, and he had a quality about him that I clocked early and filed away. He was ambitious. He watched Papa Drop ceremonies with an expression that was not quite adoration. He watched the Citadel guards with eyes that were always counting, always measuring. He had the look of a creature who was waiting for something to shift. The way he held himself at inspection, chest forward, sash straight. The posture of a man auditioning for a position that wasn't yet vacant. Told you everything about what he wanted and how he thought about the current arrangement. He was loyal the way a subordinate is loyal, when loyalty is still the most efficient path to advancement. That kind of loyalty has an expiration date, and it's marked by the moment when loyalty stops being efficient. There was also Professor Globus, Papa Drop's scientist, who came to inspect the rocket with a clipboard and a permanently aggrieved expression. Globus was brilliant in the narrow technical sense, and worried in a broader one. He had the look of a person who had served power long enough to understand what power does to things, and who has decided to be worried about this privately while continuing to serve it publicly. When he looked at the rocket, he made notes with the focused intensity of someone solving a real problem. But when he looked up from his clipboard and surveyed the pit, the prisoners, the soldiers, the whole organized cruelty of the operation, his expression shifted into something muted and careful that I think was the face of a man managing his own conscience from a safe distance. And there was Inflato, Papa Drop's personal aide, a spherical creature of extraordinary smoothness and a disposition that was either servile or terrified, possibly both. Inflato carried messages, arranged ceremonies, and had developed the particular skill of being present and invisible simultaneously that palace servants develop when the alternative is being noticed. I watched Inflato twice cross the pit yard to deliver messages to the sergeant, and both times I noticed the way his eyes moved when he thought no one was watching him, quickly, assessing exits, noting distances. Not the eyes of a true believer, the eyes of a creature with plans. These were the components. That's how I was thinking about it by the end of the first week. Not as individual creatures with their own needs and histories, though I understood they had those, but as components in a system. Because a system is what Papa Drop had built, and a system is what I was going to have to understand before I could do anything about it. Poli was my education. Every night, in the low muttering dark of the prisoner dormitory, a long stone room where they'd moved us after the first week, because the cages were needed for new arrivals, she told me more. The history of the world before Papa Drop, the specific mechanics of his propaganda. The mirrors, which were everywhere in public spaces and which were mandatorily curved, so that every roundie who looked into them saw themselves as slightly more spherical than they were, and every squarey who looked into them saw themselves as slightly more angular. The radio broadcasts, the loyalty ceremonies. Children were taught, from their earliest education, that roundness was health, and angles were sickness. He controls what they see of themselves, Poli said one night. That's the center of it. If he controls that, he controls everything. I lay in the dark thinking about that for a long time. I thought about the mirrors I'd seen in the dormitory, 2 of them, bolted to the opposite wall. I thought about the curve of the glass and what the curve did. I thought about what you would see if the glass weren't curved. And then I thought about what you would see if the glass were broken. On the 9th day, I saw Rolly. He came to the pit with a message from his father for the sergeant, and I watched him deliver it. He was a young roundie, younger than Papa Drop by decades, with his father's wide face, but without the weight of it, and with something in his expression when he looked at the squarey prisoners that was not what his father's expression was. It was not contempt. It was not indifference. It was a kind of careful, suppressed recognition, the look of someone who knows a thing and has spent a long time training themselves not to show that they know it. He caught me watching. I didn't look away. I was 9, and I didn't yet know that looking directly at power was supposed to be dangerous. He stared at me for a moment, at Waika, pressed against my leg, at the wrongness of my shape, at whatever it was about my face that apparently communicated that I was not from anywhere near here, and then he walked away. That night, Poli was gone. Her sleeping spot was empty, and her few small possessions had vanished with her. I asked quietly, and no one answered, which meant they knew, and were too afraid to say. I found out 3 days later, through Waika, who had apparently been permitted to move slightly more freely than I had been, because the soldiers found her amusing and non-threatening, that Poli had been moved to the citadel proper, and that Rolly had arranged it. I was glad, and I was afraid, and I was for the first time genuinely angry. Not at Rolly, I had seen his face. I thought I understood what he was doing, and why, even if I couldn't have articulated it then. I was angry at the system that made it necessary to smuggle kindness in through back channels, that had made the simple act of protecting someone into a covert requiring the cooperation of the dictator's own son. I went back to thinking about the mirrors. There were 2 mirrors in the prisoner dormitory. They were mandatory. Papa Drop's government had mandated that mirrors be installed in all residential spaces, including prisoner facilities, because the mirrors were part of the psychological architecture of the system. morning, every prisoner looked into a curved mirror that showed them as more angular than they were. Every morning, the message was refreshed. You are the wrong shape. You cannot change this. This is what you are. The mirrors were bolted to the wall. I spent several days looking at the bolts. The bolts were old. The walls in that section of the dormitory were older still, and the mortar around the bolt housing had been crumbling for what looked like years. Not everywhere, but in two specific points on the left mirror, the mortar had gone soft and gray, the way old mortar does when water has been finding its way through the wall above it and working at the bond over a long winter, possibly many winters. I found a thin piece of rock in the pit, flat-edged, the right size to sit flush in my palm, and kept it under my sleeping mat. I worked on the bolts every night for about a week. Small, careful movements. The kind that don't make sounds worth investigating. The other prisoners in the dormitory noticed. Some of them moved their eyes in ways that meant they had noticed, and were choosing not to have noticed. Few, in the dark, shifted slightly to block the sight lines from the grate, where a guard occasionally passed. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked what I was doing. They just arranged themselves, silently in the geometry of complicity. When the mirror finally came loose, it came quietly. The mirror tilted. I caught it, lowered it to the floor, without making enough sound to wake anyone. I smashed it against the stone floor with my boot. Then I held up one of the larger broken pieces, irregular, warped, reflecting light at angles the original mirror never intended. What you see in a broken mirror is not a stable image. It's fractured. It shows you pieces, shows you the thing from 17 angles simultaneously. It does not tell you a clean story about your shape. It shows you complexity, contingency, the way your appearance changes, depending on which piece of glass you happen to be looking at. I held the fragment up and looked at myself. I looked like myself. A small red-headed human girl with dirt on her face, and a borrowed spacesuit that was 2 sizes too large. Round. Not square, something else entirely. Something the mirror had not been built to process, and therefore could not diminish. I kept a shard. I had a use for it. The next morning I showed the shard to the prisoner sleeping nearest me, an older squarey, who hadn't spoken to me before, who had maintained the careful self-contained silence of someone who has learned that visibility is dangerous. I held the shard up and let the first gray light from the high window catch it and scatter across the ceiling in a dozen directions. He looked at the scattered light for a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the remaining mirror on the wall, intact, curved, authoritative, and then back at the ceiling, where the broken light was still moving in its quiet chaos. He said nothing. In the morning, when we were forming the line for the march to the pit, he stood next to me rather than in his usual position, and that was enough. Waika had been carrying messages back and forth between me and the other prisoners for the past week. I don't know whether Waika understood what she was carrying. I choose to believe she did. She was a space dog, after all. She had been sent into orbit. She had survived the explosion of her satellite. She had crossed a light year of anomalous space in a damaged rocket with a 9-year-old pilot and arrived on a planet that was systematically evil. She had a very good sense of what mattered. The messages were simple. They had to be simple because we had no common written language, and the only communication that worked reliably was spoken, in the moment, in Poli's dialect, which I now had enough to be functional. What I was telling the other prisoners, through Waika, through the occasional whispered exchange at the pit, was a very simple thing. I told them the story Poli had told me, the old world, the market on festival days. Roundies and squaries walking in the same streets, not equal, not without conflict, but present, coexisting, making a world together. Told it back to the prisoners who had lived it, which was a strange thing to do. But Poli had told it to me because she needed it told, and I was the one who needed to hear it. And now I was telling it to people who needed to remember what they were allowed to want. I told them something else too. I told them about the paths. There were 2 main paths through the labor pit complex. One for prisoners moving toward the excavation zone, one for prisoners moving away from it. Paths crossed in a central area, guarded by a rotating watch of 4 soldiers. Crossing point was where the sergeant did his inspections, because it was the maximum point of visibility. He could see the full flow of prisoner movement from there and adjust his counts accordingly. The paths were marked with painted stones, roundy prisoners. There were a few minor deviants who'd been swept up in broad enforcement actions. Used the left path. Squarey prisoners used the right. This was Papa Drop's system. Even in the labor pit, even in the degradation of forced work, the segregation was maintained. The roundy prisoners were technically there for re-education, not punishment, and were given marginally better rations and positions, which ensured that even in the pit there was a population with a small stake in maintaining the system. I told Waika to tell the right path prisoners that on the morning of the next third day, which was a significant day in the camp calendar, because it was when the sergeant conducted his full inspection and was therefore occupied, they should use the left path. Just that. Use the left path, no violence, no confrontation, no demands, just walk a different path. I told the left path roundy prisoners, through Wika, through the prisoners who'd confirmed they understood, that on the morning of the third day, they should use the right path. And I shard the sheet out of broken mirror to be it was, which it, because it was a piece of glass and pieces of glass are always ready. The night before the third day, I didn't sleep. Waika slept pressed against my legs, her breathing the deep, regular breathing of a creature at ease with what was coming. And I lay on my back staring at the remaining intact mirror on the wall and thinking about everything that could go wrong. There was an extensive list. A soldier could notice the path confusion early enough to restore order before it spread. The roundy prisoners could refuse to use the wrong path. After all, their marginally better treatment depended on maintaining the distinction. Papa Drop could choose that morning for an unscheduled ceremony, requiring all prisoners back to their cells. Globus could complete his assessment of the rocket and decide it was ready for launch, changing Papa Drop's timeline in ways I couldn't anticipate. I went through the list carefully, in the dark, with Waika breathing slowly beside me. I didn't find any of these fears unreasonable. I acknowledged each one, and then I set them aside, not because they weren't real, but because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing had its own list of consequences, considerably longer. On the morning of the third day, I walked to the sergeant's inspection point, not in line. I stepped out of the prisoner column and walked directly to the center of the crossing, which was, technically, forbidden, and which nobody stopped me from doing because the guards were watching the path confusion. Left path prisoners walking right. Right path prisoners walking left, the whole system of painted stones, and assigned directions suddenly illegible, and trying to understand what had gone wrong with the count. The sergeant was already there, staring at his ledger, at the prisoners, at the ledger again. I held up the shard of broken mirror. I held it so it caught the light from the sky above the pit, which was a pale violet on that planet, lighter and more open than I'd been used to. And in the morning it had a particular quality of diffused brightness that scattered beautifully off irregular glass. The light hit the sergeant's face at 17 angles, simultaneously. Fractured light. Light that didn't tell a clean story about anything. He looked at it. He looked at me. He looked at the paths. At the roundy prisoners where the squarey prisoners should be. At the squarey prisoners where the roundy prisoners should be. At the system that was supposed to keep them apart failing, in real time. With no violence, no riot, no identifiable cause beyond the decision of two groups of people to walk slightly differently than they'd been told. I said, in Poli's dialect, the thing I'd rehearsed. He controls what you see of yourself. That's the center of it. I'm not going to claim the sergeant had a conversion experience. He didn't. He was not a good creature, and he never became one. What happened is more complicated and in some ways more interesting. The sergeant looked at the fractured light, and the mixed paths, and the small human girl standing in the center of his inspection point, holding a broken mirror, and he made a calculation. He calculated that the system he was propping up had a weakness at its center that it would not easily survive. He calculated that Papa Drop's power was less solid than it appeared. He calculated that being the one who was standing nearest to Papa Drop, when that power failed, was not strategically an ideal position. He stepped aside, not dramatically. He just moved out of the center of the crossing and let the prisoners continue to walk whichever path they'd chosen. That was the moment. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd half imagined in my more hopeful moments. Not a battle or a declaration or a speech. Just a large, ambitious creature, making a cold calculation and deciding not to be the last person holding a broken system together. I went to find Rolly. He was in the Citadel, in a room near the maintenance corridors, where the servants moved between the formal spaces of the palace. I'd been told where to find him through Waika, who had been told by Poli, who was there. I walked through a servant corridor with Waika at my heels and found them together in a small stone room with no windows and a single dim light. And what I saw on their faces when I came in was the particular expression of people who have been waiting quietly and for a very long time for something to be possible. I told Rolly what had happened in the pit. He was quiet for a long moment. Shh. Then he said something I've translated differently over the years and probably still don't have quite right. The closest I can get in English is, "My father is afraid of empty rooms." I asked what that meant. "His power is a performance," Rolly said. "The ceremonies, the mirrors, the marching and the sashes and the inspection of shapes. It requires an audience. Everyone present, in their assigned place, enacting the correct roles. If the audience stops performing, the performance stops." "So we empty the room," I said. "You've already started?" Rolly said, and gestured at the door. And I understood that what had happened in the pit had already reached the Citadel. That word travels in closed systems, faster than the people who run those systems would prefer. Globus, the professor, was the unexpected variable. He'd been quietly horrified by the rocket project for weeks. Not for moral reasons, primarily, but for technical ones. He did not believe the rocket could be safely launched with the modifications Papa Drop had demanded. He had filed 3 reports saying so and received 3 orders to proceed anyway. When the system began to fracture around him, he made a different calculation than the sergeant had, but arrived at a similar conclusion. He went to Rolly and offered his full cooperation in exchange for being allowed to live somewhere that was not this planet. He wanted passage. He wanted out. He had spent 30 years serving a system he had been telling himself he was only observing from a safe professional distance. And the distance had collapsed, and now all he had left was the exit. Globus was useful. He knew the rocket. He knew it better than I did, which is a low bar, given that I'd flown it with no training, but his knowledge was technical and specific, and what we needed now was technical and specific. The nose was buried 6 meters down. Fuel reserves were partially depleted from the trajectory correction I'd attempted before impact. The navigational systems had been damaged by the shockwave, and subsequently by the impact itself, and Globus had been tasked by Papa Drop with repairing them for the launch, which meant he'd already done half the work we needed done. The rocket was still in the pit, about 60% excavated by that point. The squarey prisoners had been doing the digging, the guards standing aside, not in solidarity exactly, more in the bewildered passivity of people whose instructions had stopped making sense, and who hadn't yet received new ones. The digging continued. Globus redirected the work. Instead of preparing the rocket for Papa Drop's launch, he began preparing it for mine. Drop noticed. Of course he noticed. He was not stupid. I want to be careful not to flatten him into a fool, because he wasn't. He was a man who had built something genuinely complex and had maintained it for years, and who had a sophisticated understanding of the mechanisms by which power sustains itself. He noticed the performance stopping. He called ceremonies that no one came to. He summoned soldiers who arrived late and stood in the wrong places. He sent for Inflato, and Inflato came, but slowly, and with something new in his face that Papa Drop would have recognized if he'd let himself, as the early stages of looking for the exit. Papa Drop did, in the end, was the thing authoritarian leaders always do when the performance fails. He tried to make it bigger. He called for a grand ceremony. He summoned everyone, prisoners, soldiers, servants, his own son, to the central square of the Citadel for a public declaration of loyalty and a display of the correct shapes. He sent soldiers to collect the prisoners. He ordered Inflato to prepare the mirrors. All of them, arranged in a great semicircle around the square, so that the assembled crowd would see themselves reflected from every angle. I think he believed that if he could get everyone in the room one more time, if he could get the performance started again, momentum would carry it. He had run it successfully. for so long that he perhaps couldn't quite believe it had stopped. He was trying to relight a fire with the same match. We went to the square, all of us. Prisoners and guards and servants and Globus and Rolly and Inflato, who had made his calculation and positioned himself near the back of the crowd in a way that would allow him to move quickly in any direction. Papa Drop began to speak. His voice was still that low, resonant thing, designed by biology to carry across stone rooms without effort. He spoke about the perfected world. He spoke about roundness as virtue and angles as corruption. He spoke about the threats that surrounded the world, the enemies outside, the deviants within, the forces of imperfection that would undo everything he had built if the people did not remain vigilant and united. He was good at it. I want to give him that. The speech had been refined over decades, and every word was placed to do work, to remind, to reassure, to isolate, to define. In the old days, with the right mirrors, and the right crowd, and the right ambient conditions of fear and compliance, it would have worked. Here is what had happened to the mirrors. Rolly had been busy the night before, with a handful of servants who had made their decision, and a small collection of tools. He had not removed the mirrors. He had done something simpler. He had replaced them. Not with flat mirrors. Flat mirrors would have been noticeable, would have been a direct challenge that Papa Drop could address. He had replaced the curved mirrors with broken ones, irregular, fractured, 17 angles simultaneously. The crowd stood in the square and looked at the mirrors that surrounded them and saw themselves the way I'd first seen myself in the pit. Fragmented, complex, not cleanly storied. Not round, not square, not reduced to a single verdict by a carefully curved pane of glass. Just themselves, multiplied, shown from every angle at once, too complicated to be summarized by a shape. Papa Drop kept speaking. The crowd looked at the mirrors. I was standing near the back of the prisoner group. Waika pressed against my left leg, and I watched it happen. It's hard to describe precisely what it was, because it was not one moment, but many moments compressing together. It was the moment when a roundy soldier looked at his own fragmented reflection and then looked at the squarey prisoner standing next to him and could not quite find the difference he'd been trained to find. It was the moment when two prisoners who had been walking different paths for 2 years made accidental eye contact in the mirror, and both of them saw from 17 angles that they were in the same room and the same situation and wearing the same expressions. It was the moment when the performance, the great orchestrated performance of correct shapes, required its audience to enact their assigned roles. And the audience looked at their reflections and couldn't find the roles in there, couldn't find the clean verdict, couldn't find the simple story. Pa Drop's voice kept going for a while, because it was a good voice. And it had carried that stone room for a long time, and some things continue by inertia after the reason for them has stopped. But the room was emptying. Not physically. Everyone was still there, standing in the square. The room was emptying in the way Rolly had described, in the withdrawal of the performance, in the faces that were looking at broken mirrors instead of at their dictator, in the soldiers who were holding their weapons with diminishing conviction. The sergeant moved first. He had been waiting for the moment to shift, and he had decided this was it. He walked to the center of the square, stood in the space between the crowd and Papa Drop, and said something in the native language that I couldn't translate in the moment, but that Polly described to me later. He said, roughly, "The count does not match the record. It's a bureaucratic phrase, a supply chain phrase, the language of ledgers and logistics." What it meant in context was, this is not adding up, the accounting is wrong, the system doesn't balance. Papa Drop looked at the sergeant. The sergeant looked at Papa Drop. And the thing that passed between them, the specific recognition that the performance was over, that there was no one left to perform it, that the audience had looked at their broken reflections and found something that the script hadn't accounted for, was quiet and complete and very final. I want to be honest. I don't know exactly what happened to Papa Drop after that. I was 9. And within the hour, Rolly had me and Waika moving through the maintenance corridors of the Citadel toward the pit, toward the rocket, toward Globus, who was standing next to it with a checklist and an expression that suggested he had been waiting and for everyone to catch up to where he'd been for the past 3 days. What I know is that By the time the rocket cleared the pit and pointed itself at the sky, the square was still busy with the complicated, disorderly, slightly desperate work of a system trying to figure out what it was without the thing that had been holding it in its current shape. That work was going to be long and imperfect. I knew that even at 9. Rolly knew it better than anyone. Polly, standing next to him as I climbed the ladder into the rocket, knew it best of all. She'd lived in the wreckage of one world already, and she knew what the construction of the next one looked like. Clean, not quick, full of the friction of people who had been formed by the old system trying to learn how to be in a different one. Looked at me as I was going up the ladder. She had the expression of someone who wants to say something and is trying to find the right words in a language that isn't quite hers. She said, finally was, "You didn't know you couldn't." I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. She was right, in the specific sense that I hadn't known the system well enough to understand where it was supposed to be inviolable. I hadn't been shaped by it. I hadn't been taught, from childhood, that the mirrors told the truth, that the paths were necessary, that the shape of your body was the shape of your worth. I'd arrived from outside carrying none of that, which meant I could see the architecture in a way the people inside it couldn't. Not because I was smarter, but because I hadn't been built into the architecture. I could see the curve in the glass because no one had taught me to call it flat. But it was theirs. Shh, that's the important part. What air from the rooms from the Papa Drop's perfected world? It was going to be built by the people who lived in it. And it was going to be built with the knowledge that the shape of your body was not the shape of your worth. They knew that now. They'd seen it in the broken mirrors, in 17 angles simultaneously. And that's not the kind of thing you unsee. Globus had repaired the navigational systems. The launch was rough. The pit hadn't been designed as a launch facility, and the angle of egress was about 4 degrees off ideal. But I'd flown a borrowed American rocket with no training into the orbital path of a decaying satellite, so I was not by that point intimidated by suboptimal launch conditions. We cleared the atmosphere. Below us, through the small porthole, Pyre Squared was a pale shape against the dark. Not round, not square, not the perfected world or the place of correct forms. Just a planet, complicated and real, with people on it who were in the early stages of figuring out what they were going to do with themselves. Waika climbed into my lap. She smelled like dust and old copper, and the particular resinous grass of the labor pit. And she pressed her nose against my chin and sighed, the long, complete sigh of a creature who has decided that the current situation is acceptable. I set the course for home. I've been asked over the years what the lesson is. People want a clean extraction. They want the thing that a 9-year-old girl accidentally stumbled into that, broke a planetary regime, to resolve into a principle they can write on a wall somewhere. They want it to be about courage, or strategy, or the power of truth, or the importance of questioning authority. It wasn't any of those things. Or it was all of them and none of them is sufficient. What I did mostly was look. I looked at the mirrors and understood what they were doing. I looked at the paths and understood that they were performing a division rather than enforcing one. I looked at the sergeant and saw ambition that was waiting for the right opening. I looked at Rolly and saw knowledge he'd been carrying alone for years, in the careful suppressed way of someone who has understood a thing and has nowhere safe to put the understanding. I looked at Globus and saw a man who had convinced himself he was only the technical problem and was ready to stop believing that. I looked at Papa Drop and saw under the crimson sash and the resonant voice and the decades of institutional power, a performance that required an audience and stopped making sense the moment the audience stopped performing. I was 9. I had no training in political science or systems analysis or the mechanics of authoritarian legitimacy. What I had was the simple human habit of looking at things and asking whether they had to be that way. Whether the story the thing was telling about itself was the true story, whether the reflection in the mirror was accurate, or whether someone had curved the glass. That's all I had. Turned out to be enough. Not because it was sufficient on its own, it wasn't. It was enough because there were people on Pyre Squared who already knew what I was looking at, and who had been waiting, in the dark, for someone who wasn't trapped inside the system to name it. Polly had the knowledge but not the position. Rolly had the access but not the distance. Globus had the technical capability but not the will. The sergeant had the power but not the motive. Until I gave him one, I was the one who came from outside. That was the only special fun thing about me. Not cleverness, not courage, not some human genius for freedom. Just outside. Just. Not shaped by what they were shaped by. Just. Not knowing. When I walked into that courtyard with a Russian dog and a borrowed spacesuit, that I was supposed to accept the story the mirrors were telling. Came home. Waika came with me because she was my dog now and that was settled. She had been a Russian space dog, technically, but she had orbited the Earth alone in a broken satellite and crossed anomalous space in a damaged rocket with a 9-year-old pilot. And whatever that makes, it makes you mine. It took a long time for anyone to believe what had happened. Longer still for anyone to decide what to do about it. Whether the planet needed diplomats or aid or observation or simply to be left alone to work through the rubble of Papa Drop's government in their own way. Those conversations are still happening in some room I'm not invited into, and I've made peace with that. What I know is that there is a planet, somewhere past the orbital belt, where the mirrors are flat now, where the paths through the market are unmarked. Two people who used to walk on festival days in the old world are building something in the new one. Imperfectly, and together. I know because Waika still carries messages sometimes. She has always known which ones matter. There's a particular morning I come back to, when I'm trying to explain any of this to someone who wasn't there. It's the morning after I broke the mirror in the dormitory, before anyone knew what I was planning, before the path confusion, and the sergeant's cold calculation, and the grand ceremony with the broken glass. When I held a shard up to the first light from the high window, and the old squarey prisoner looked at the scattered light on the ceiling, and then looked at the intact curved mirror on the wall, and then looked at me. He didn't say anything. None of them did. They just arranged themselves in the geometry of complicity, the quiet human, or in this case, the quiet alien, but it amounts to the same thing. Arrangement of people who have decided, without a word, that something matters and they are going to help. It was the moment I believed we were going to make it. Not the sergeant standing aside, not the broken mirrors in the square, not the rocket clearing the pit and the pale violet sky opening up above us. That morning, in the dark, with the fractured light moving on the ceiling and a room full of people silently rearranging themselves. I was 9. I was a long way from home, and every person in that room had been there for years and hadn't broken yet. I thought, if they haven't broken, we haven't lost. We hadn't.